One of the challenges associated with this thinker of massive importance, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, is figuring out where to start, and not just in general, like where to start with his works, but where to start in talking about how to productively study him. And unfortunately, for these videos about self-directed study, they already have a kind of structure and format, and so I'm going to honor that, although I'm going to deviate from it a bit as we discuss this particular thinker and how you might get something out of his work. So I typically begin these by talking about why would you want to study the thinker who we're looking at all? Why approach them? What's important about them? What are you going to get out of studying them? What could be your motivation? And I think when it comes to Hegel, there's just a vast variety of things that we could bring up. So, we could start by talking about his importance as a philosopher to begin with. He's up there with Plato and Aristotle and Descartes and, going back a little bit, Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, at least in the history of Western philosophy. Love him, hate him, don't read him, read him. It's at least acknowledged by many people that historically he has been of massive importance and influence. And some people do consider him to be, not just somebody who was historically influential, but a first-rate philosopher. That's a big open question that we can ask. So he is massively influential. I think if you're going to study philosophy and you're going to try to do some justice to what we traditionally have called its canon or its history, you probably want to read at least some of Hegel to get an idea of what is going on in his text, what he brings to the table, what he has to offer. And you could get this through a lot of different works, some of them by Hegel himself, some of them secondary literature or even appropriations of Hegel. We'll talk about the difference and the difficulty of sometimes distinguishing between the two of those a little bit later on in this. You could also perhaps read Hegel out of a kind of historical interest. He has been massively influential in history itself, so it's not just that he was somebody along the way who had some great ideas that other people rejected, interpreted, played off of, appropriated. He's also, in the middle of history and looking back at history and looking ahead and even speculating about the very meaning of history itself. So that, in the late 20th century, we could have people taking up a particular interpretation of Hegel. In the end of history, you may recognize Francis Fukuyama and his Kojevian interpretation. So that's another reason, historical interest. I think that there's also, like with many of the thinkers that we would want to study, you can read them for the positive doctrines, the contributions that they're making. You could say, I want to know what Hegel actually thinks about this matter, about, say, human freedom, or about how society ought to be organized, or about the nature of space and time, or pick any other sort of topic. And you can say, well, I want to know what the guy actually has to say about these matters. And, first I'm going to figure out what he has to say, and then I'll figure out, is he actually correct about these things? If he is correct, maybe I'll take on some of his ideas and incorporate them into my life. And I think that that actually can be a very productive approach to looking at not just Hegel, but other authors as well. You don't have to go in 100% and say, well, I'm going to believe everything that the person says. I'm going to mine them for things that I think could be insightful or useful. And, so maybe Hegel is right about certain things that you would want to take on. You've got to study him in order to figure that out. I would also say that although there isn't a single clearly laid out dialectical method in Hegel's work. And anybody who tells you that there is just one single thing is selling you a line or misinformed themselves, as we'll talk about in a bit, particularly with respect to thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the so-called Hegelian dialectic, which is not so. You can actually, by working through his texts, learn a good bit about how to think dialectically, by following it out, sort of like tracing out other people's work. As an artist, you learn how to draw yourself, or looking at models, this is how I could paint. So there's something of that in studying Hegel's works as well. I think that there's also this is going to sound a little facetious, but it's along the lines of, well, everybody's doing it, so why shouldn't I? Now, not everybody's reading Hegel. There's a lot of people who claim to be reading or studying Hegel who, let's be honest, actually aren't. They're just, doing a little bit of stuff, and they're not really spending a lot of time with this text. But there are a lot of people out there, and not just in the present, but tracing all the way back to Hegel's own time, who thought that this is really quite valuable. And, you could say, well, that many people, smart people, probably aren't, entirely wrong. Now, to be sure, there's many smart people who've also dismissed Hegel or criticized him, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, and maybe you should take them into account as well. But I think there's something there. And then, finally, if you are kind of a joiner type and you want to be on, as we call it, Team Hegel, I've done other video about what I call texts with auras. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is one of those that I discussed, because there's a lot of people who feel like Hegel unlocked the mysteries of the universe, and it's usually the phenomenology that they're turning to and not his other works that they also should be reading, that they take as doing this. And, so you might be reading Hegel because you want to be a Hegelian, just like some people, I suppose, would, read Descartes or Hume for similar reasons, or they read Stoic literature because they're on Team Stoicism, or, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle with others. And I'm not going to say that that's a terrible reason. I understand that that's going to be the motivation for some people, but hopefully these other possible motivations would be more predominant, thinking that, hey, there's something here that I can get out of this. I don't have to buy into the whole totality of his works, but I'm going to get some valuable insights from it. He's clearly an important thinker who has some interesting things. He could be wrong about everything, but I won't know until I actually study it for myself. So that's probably enough at this point about, motivation for studying this great thinker, Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. If you're going to be engaging in self-directed study of any philosopher, there are some natural questions that will arise about their texts and editions, and if they're not writing in English, the translations that you should be relying upon. We're going to put off the order in which you might approach the text to the next section, and we're going to talk here about some of the more practical questions that arise from the very beginning. And I'll say that, with Hegel, it's not just a matter of what translations we're going to use or look at or acquire. There's some other things that I think for many readers, especially given the notorious difficulty of Hegel's texts and his style of writing, these are going to arise. So, one common issue that comes up with some self-directed study readers, people who are engaging in this, is, am I smart enough to actually read this and get something out of this? And that's not just with Hegel. People worry about that with Aristotle or with David Hume, or pick whoever you want. But with Hegel, I think a lot more people probably have that worry. And I would say right off the bat, don't let that keep you from going into Hegel's texts. you're not going to get everything out of the text any more than you do with anybody else, but it's probably going to be a steeper learning curve at first with Hegel. He's not too hard for readers. It's just that it takes a lot of work. And some of that is Hegel's own fault. He is not a great, clear stylist by any means, and this goes not just for in English translation, but also in the original German as well. I don't know anybody who reads Hegel because he's such a wonderful writer. They read it for the ideas that they're trying to get. And so, that might be something to keep in mind right off the bat. Another thing is, as you approach Hegelian texts, perhaps more so than with many other philosophers, you may feel yourself to be kind of in a foreign world where people are talking a weird language and you're not even sure. I mean, you know what some of the words mean, like and, the, more, less, but then there's all these other bits of terminology, and you could think of it as an entire lore that is permeating these texts, and that is going to be part of what you're going to be struggling with, and eventually, hopefully, making some progress into and understanding. So that's some important stuff to keep in mind. Now let's get to the nitty gritty. Now you're going to say, well, which texts, which versions, which editions, which translations should I be reading? And I'm going to talk about this in the next section. I don't actually suggest beginning where almost everybody seems to want to begin today, with the phenomenology of spirit, or in one earlier translation, the phenomenology of mind. But I know that a lot of people are going to do that anyway. So let's talk, rather briefly about translations of the phenomenology of spirit. So we're kind of fortunate in that in the past, these were the two main ones. An older one, the phenomenology of mind, translated by J.B. Bailey, with an introduction by Georg Lichtenheim, and this one has been more or less surpassed. It's not going to hurt you to read it, but I don't actually suggest beginning your study of the phenomenology with this. There are some people who really enjoy this particular older version. In the time that I was first studying Hegel back in graduate school, this was the sort of standard text by Miller. And each of these texts I'll mention too, consulted the previous translations. They didn't just start out, completely raw. One of the things that you're going to find, which is definitely an improvement of the one over the other, first of all, getting the language a little bit more right, although Miller does tend towards, a little bit of monkeying around with the language, is that the Bailey translation does not have numbered paragraphs. The Miller translation does. And that is quite important because in the literature on this and, resources that are available, you're going to see people referencing, all right, in paragraph 149 in Force and the Understanding, here's what's happening. Now, the numbering is not exactly the same from edition to edition, so we should mention that as well. And then, in the last decade, we have had 3 new translations in English come out of the phenomenology. We have this one by Cambridge University Press, Terry Pinkard. This is actually, at this point in time, my favorite translation. I would suggest, maybe getting the Miller and also getting the Pinkard translation. But there are these other two as well. Michael Inwood has a quite good translation as well that came out from Oxford University Press. So that's kind of nice to have. And then there's this other one, Peter Fuss and John Dobbins, The Phenomenology of Spirit from University of Notre Dame Press. And for some reasons that I'll tell you about, I'm not as big on this one. I've looked at like some of the ways in which things are rendered and the vocabulary that's being used, and this is a lot of subjective preference, I would say. I would say that Miller, you just kind of get used to. He's been around for such a long time; it's hard to get away from it. But I think Pinkert is really quite good, staying very close to the German text and letting you kind of make up your mind. I think the Inwood is often quite good as well. I'm a little less sold on some of the word choices in the Fuss and Dobbins, and so maybe I wouldn't go with that. And there's some other issues as well. The Fuss and Dobbins, you notice the very first paragraph is quite short in this. Well, that's because they've taken the first paragraph and broken it up into two paragraphs. So their numbering doesn't actually match the numbering in these other three volumes. And I will mention that, at a certain point in the Pinkert, the numbering is changing from that in the Miller and then coming back to it. Those aren't really that big of a deal. And you could get any of these. You could get your hands on any of them, and you can understand some things. I will also point out that a translation sometimes isn't just a translation. There'll be some other things. You want to take a look at the introduction. Pinkert's introduction, has got Hegel's path to the phenomenology. It's giving you a lot of important background, a discussion, what is a phenomenology, brief overview of the book, and at the end there's a nice index. Miller's, of course, has all of these summaries that he's providing, little 3 to 4 line discussions of what's happening. Inwood's, this book is quite thick, and that's because he's not only got an editor's introduction, which is worth reading, I would say, for its own sake, but also he provides you with his own commentary, a much more extensive one in the back, and he, like some of the others, have glossaries of key terms, which is quite nice to have, since Hegel does have all that terminology. In the Fuss and Dobbins, there's also an introduction here. Here's actually an interesting line from it. As for our translation, our primary goal is to render Hegel's argument perspicuous, a seeing through in a triple sense, seeing through the eyes of disparate modes of self-consciousness, seeing the potential deficiencies, delusions, and deceptions of each, and seeing through the whole argument to its ultimate conclusion, right? Interpreting it as an argument is already sort of a choice there. And then, as we get to the back, there's a conceptual and topical index, which is kind of nice with, telling you what sections you're going to find it in. I will also point out that the Fuss and Dobbins not only doesn't have the same numbering, it also, from section to section, begins the numbering again, which can be a bit confusing. So we've got, already here, we have these 5 different, distinct translations of the phenomenology of spirit. So you have a wide choice in English of what it is that you're going to be studying. I wouldn't worry over much about having the best translation. I would worry more about the better and the worse. So obviously you don't want to be, just using the Bailey translation. The Miller translation is okay. It's still kind of a standard reference, but I think it's being superseded in favor of some of these others that'll probably generations from now be considered more important. Does that have to weigh on you right now? No. That's. You don't have to worry about future posterity as you approach this for the very first time. but it's kind of good to keep in mind. And you're going to find similar issues with Hegel's other, massively important works. For example, The Science of Logic. You can find a lot of old copies of older translations out there, but you can also find newer translations. And I would go with the newer ones in this, because in some parts, the newer are not only using a vocabulary that's closer to us in time, but you might say, this is overgeneralizing, there's less sloppiness about how to render things. I realized this recently when a tutorial student wanted to go and look at a particular section of The Science of Logic, and I was comparing the two different translations, and I was like, oh, this older translation, they're taking a few liberties with the chapter headings, right? Dasein they were translating as determinate being rather than as existence. So, there's some things like that to keep in mind. But I don't think you have to be super concerned about, having the best translation. So maybe that'll put your mind at ease about this. Next, we'll talk about the, details, which books you should be checking out, how to get the most out of your foray into Hegel. So as you've heard me mention, and you might have seen me say in other places, I actually don't suggest that if you're going to study Hegel, you begin with the, as so many people want to do, the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's a cool book. There's a lot of great stuff there, but there are some serious difficulties in approaching it. And one of the biggest of these is that Hegel typically doesn't name names. He will go through all of these interesting dialectical advances, and you got to figure out or find some commentary to tell you who and what he's talking about, right? So I don't actually suggest beginning with this. And for a number of years, I've been, as people ask me, giving a kind of pat answer saying, you should begin with some of his lectures, and in particular, one of two different sets of lectures, and they actually are kind of flipped. This is what we call a chiasm. There's lectures on the history of philosophy, and then there's lectures on the philosophy of history, sometimes the philosophy of world history, right? And so I think that those are both good places to begin. And one of the big reasons is you get to see who he's talking about because he names names. So in the section on, Stoicism in the Phenomenology, he's telling you some stuff, but he never names any Stoics at all. And his rendering of Stoicism in the Phenomenology is admittedly a little bit weak, right? It's focusing on certain aspects that he's interested in and ignoring others. In the discussion of Stoicism in the history of philosophy, there's still some gaps, but he's actually saying, here's what Chrysippus says. Here's what, or what we know about Chrysippus from other people saying it. Here's what this thinker says. Here's what this thinker says. Here's here's the ideas that they're putting forth. So that's a bit more helpful. Same thing with discussing historical matters in the phenomenology. You often gotta, kind of think to yourself, okay, so what is actually happening here in terms of wealth and state power? Who does he mean? In the philosophy of history, he will actually tell you what he's got in mind, right? And so that's kind of good. And you're going to get way more in the philosophy of history. I just opened this up to sort of a random page, and here he's talking about the objective work of art, right? So it's not just history, but also the development of culture and, bringing in other things, political institutions, art, religion, all of that sort of stuff. You'll also get a good sense of how he sees things developing and building and flowing and differentiating them from each other with those two sets of lectures. I also thought that, there might be some other decent starting points, and one is I have the German here. I bought this back in graduate school, and I've, taken a lot of toll on it. The System der Sittlichkeit, which is also called the System of Ethical Life. This is an early work, and I think this could be a decent, interesting introduction for readers to, at least get used to Hegelian terminology and Hegel's way of organizing things. You don't necessarily have to agree with everything that he's saying in here, but there's a coherent, well-worked-out discussion. Another work that could be quite worthwhile is what is often called I'm trying to find it right here, the philosophical propedeutic. There we go. And this one is, propedeutic is like, what you have students reading so that they can make sense out of something that's a bit more complicated. And, these are sort of guides for his students. And, you notice that so we've got the parts of the propedeutic in relation to the later works, which is quite nice. Here it gives you an idea of how these things connect to each other. And then it's like short little passages giving you more or less like the Hegelian take in of course, the abstract about a number of different things. And he begins with the science of laws, morals, and religion for the lower class, the earlier students, right? And then he's got logic, and then we have the science of the concept and the philosophical encyclopedia. So that might be interesting. I don't know the average reader. It's probably going to open up a lot more questions than it actually solves for them, because it's designed to lead them into the Hegelian system. But it could be a good starting point. And then, once you've started to get your head around Hegel, you've read through at least one of these books at least once, maybe gotten half of what's going on, maybe being a little bit befuddled, then you can start turning to the big books, right? And so, one of the options is, in fact, to go to the Phenomenology. It's a very important early work. Much more important in the 20th century and the 21st century than it was in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was more the later works. There are two logics that Hegel brought out. One is called the science of logic, which you heard me reference already, talking about that with, my student who we were looking at a certain section called existence. That is a very dense work. Well worth reading. It'll take you a long time to work your way through. If you think that the phenomenology is tricky, I think you'll find the science of logic even more so. Then there's the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, also called the Encyclopedia Logic. That's a bit more, I would say, easy to wrap your head around. If you've read the Phenomenology and then you read the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, you're going to notice some overlap. And actually, the same goes for reading these other works. Hegel will retrace the same ground at multiple points. And then there is, of course, the fourth big book, the Philosophy of Right, which is, let's call it social political theory, and it's a more mature work. That was massively influential in the 19th century, continued to have important influence in the 20th century, where quite a few people also used it to blame Hegel for all sorts of things that probably Hegel would not have been for, like, say, Nazism or totalitarianism in general. But these are works that you can check out. And I would say make sure, if you're going to study these, that you allot yourself plenty of time to do so. Hegel is not somebody who you're going to blaze your way through, let alone speed read or anything like that. You gotta work quite a bit with this. So maybe, this year you study the Phenomenology after reading some of these other texts, and then the next year, after you've gone through the Phenomenology, maybe once or twice, you go on to, say, the Philosophy of Right. We should also talk about some of the other things that Hegel wrote. You've already heard me mention some of his lectures. This is one that I particularly like. The lectures on the philosophy of religion. Hegel has a lot of interesting things to say about religion, some of which are, possibly correct, some of which are, a bit off base, but are still quite interesting. He's got a very complex way of understanding what religion is about. He's carrying out a kind of philosophical anthropology. These are, notes from what it was that Hegel was presenting to his own students. There are also lectures on aesthetics, which deal with the various forms of art. Very interesting stuff as well. We've already mentioned the lectures on the philosophy of history, the lectures on the history of philosophy, and then there's also lectures on proofs for the existence of God. And all of these are things that you might find worth digging into, and you could approach some of those before going to the phenomenology. If you're really interested in what Hegel has to say about religion, I would actually suggest going to these lectures, and seeing what you've got there, rather than looking at the much shorter and, in some respects, more summary treatments of religion, for example, in the phenomenology. If you want to know what Hegel thinks about particular philosophers, read the lectures on the philosophy of history, rather than just focusing on the phenomenology, seeing where they fit in with that, or the philosophy of right, or the various logics, right? And now we should also talk about secondary literature. It's, incredibly tempting to think that, this is so hard, maybe I shouldn't start by actually reading Hegel. Maybe I should read some stuff about Hegel. And, I think that could be a decent way to go. And you want to keep in mind with any secondary literature that you're getting an interpretation of Hegel. You're not approaching Hegel directly. And the interpretations can be very well thought out, well argued, rather faithful to Hegel's own spirit and text, but they are still interpretations. So you do need to be a bit careful about that. And I'm going to begin by talking about histories of philosophy. So I actually, it is a recent history of philosophy by A.C. Grayling, and he's got a section on Hegel. And what do we find him doing? Giving some summary about Hegel's biography and what he's interested in. And by the time that we get to, a few pages in, we see that Hegel is being identified with, here we go, a given state of affairs can be thought of as the thesis to which an opposite and antithesis poses itself. From the confrontation between them emerges a new state of affairs, the synthesis. The synthesis becomes a new thesis to which another antithesis opposes itself, thus producing a further synthesis. This again becomes the thesis to which an antithesis opposes itself, and so on and so on. The final self-understanding of Geist, spirit, is the final synthesis of the historical dialectical chain that brought it to this point. Now, you may not know much about Hegel, but at least you should know that Hegel did not work in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And, you could say that he does so at times, but, take the phenomenology. You are not going to find that happening here. You will find triadic schemas, you will find developments, but you are not going to find this cookie-cutter approach that so many people are crediting Hegel with. And Grayling seems to have just, uncritically bought into from others. I'm trying to look around for my Friedrich Cobblestone, and it's not coming immediately to mind. But, Friedrich Cobblestone, another person who wrote a history of philosophy a long time ago, he's got an entire section on why you shouldn't attribute to Hegel thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He's a more faithful historian of philosophy. So you want to be a little careful in who you use for your interpreters when we're talking about histories of philosophy that are not just focused on Hegel. And then there's all sorts of other things that you might turn to that would be, potentially helpful. Two books that will be familiar to anybody who's learning about Hegel through the continental tradition. Alexander Kojèv's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. Well worth checking out. I would say that you're getting more Kojèv than you are Hegel, even though he is quoting Hegel quite a lot and trying to connect things, historically to different movements and ideas and developments. And it's not going to so long as you don't assume that Kojèv is the perfect interpreter, it's not going to destroy your capacity to understand Hegel. Somebody who's a little bit more faithful, I would say, Jean Hippolyte, Genesis and Structure of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I like this. Hippolyte, by the way, was the French translator of Hegel, and his translation is quite interesting. It's got lots and lots of footnotes. If you read French, you might want to check it out. Here's a few other things. David James, Hegel, A Guide for the Perplexed. Not bad. It begins in interesting ways. It starts with basically with Hegel's philosophy of subjective spirit, and then jumps right into the philosophy of right and kind of works its way around. It's got a section on art and religion, metaphysics of freedom. It's connecting Hegel up with different people. And so you're getting another take. I remember reading this Stanley Rosen's book years and years and years ago, G.W.F. Hegel, An Introduction to the Science of Wisdom. Rosen is a very interesting American reader of continental philosophy. You could say the same about Kaufman as well. Some recent stuff. You may recognize this massive tome by Robert Brandom, A Spirit of Trust, a reading of Hegel's phenomenology. Brandom succeeds in providing a reading which is even longer than Hegel's phenomenology, but it's quite interesting. It's well organized. There's a lot of, you could call it, historical research that goes into this, connecting the dots. Also, you can say that Hippolyte is good with that. And Brandom recently also gave, here in Milwaukee, this little book is his Aquinas lecture, Heroism and Magnanimity, the Postmodern Form of Self-Conscious Agency. He gave this in 2019, and I was actually there for it. It was quite a nice session that he gave. Skipping back a little bit, here's some other things. Here's Holgate's Introduction to Hegel, which I think is a decent work to get your head around that. He begins by saying, opinions about Hegel are, to say the least, mixed, right? And that's quite true. And I think that Holgate's commentary is quite useful. We've got Robert Solomon, the great existentialist writer, who, predictably enough, says the Hegel who will emerge from the following pages and from the phenomenology is a very humanist and human Hegel, right? A little bit scrolling down, he says, he is an existentialist of sorts, as Merleau-Ponty argued some 25 years ago. So, Solomon is interpreting Hegel in his particular way. And then, has a nice glossary of terms translated into ordinary English. Those sorts of things can be very useful. The other one, there's many, many secondary sources. I'm not going to go through all of them. But one of the other ones I would like to mention is, if you don't know, Martin Heidegger actually gave lectures on Hegel, and I think these are quite insightful. It's unfortunate that the lectures only cover the very first parts of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and that is why they are so short. You might also look at collections of essays. Here's a common, example: Cambridge Companion to Hegel. I believe this was edited by, Beiser. So you've got, things on Hegel's intellectual development, his conception of logic, the dialectical method, Hegel's ethics, and by some really, great Hegel scholars. So this sort of thing can be quite interesting, and you'll find all sorts of guides. There is also one other book that I would like to bring up in some respect, in a sentimental way. So this is Hegel, a collection of critical essays from 1972, so a little bit dated, edited by Alistair MacIntyre, and he's bringing together Walter Kaufmann, Findlay, Robert Solomon, who we just talked about, Charles Taylor. Alistair MacIntyre has a wonderful essay in there called Hegel on Faces and Skulls, which is about one particular section of the phenomenology, but also has some great implications for other matters. And I think this is quite good. He also begins, no philosophers suffered more from enthusiastic misrepresentation than Hegel, sometimes by professed followers, more often by would-be critics, and no philosopher, not even Plato or Marx, has aroused more violent passions. The result is the existence of a very odd literature about Hegel. And I think that's a great way to cap this off. When you're reading secondary literature about Hegel, it can be illuminating, it can be very helpful, but you're always getting it from somebody's take. Sooner or later, you want to read Hegel for himself and for yourself. So that's probably enough about which text to begin with. Again, I don't suggest beginning with the phenomenology, but I know that half of you are probably going to do that. So, forewarned is forearmed, and let's move on to the next stuff. As with any philosopher who you're going to attempt to study on your own, or even with the help of other people, understanding them within a certain context is important, a historical context, an intellectual context, and understanding their own motivations as far as we can tell what they are, their projects, what it is that they're about. All of that can be very helpful to keep in mind. So let's start by talking about historical context to begin with. Hegel is part of this movement that we often call German Idealism, and we credit Kant for really getting it rolling. Idealism is not something absolutely new with Kant. Kant himself talks about Descartes and Berkeley and others as idealists and distinguishes his own form against them. And Kant has this critical project going on. A lot of people think that, you have to read the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, before you can approach Hegel. I don't actually think that that's the case. I think that you can, maybe learn a few things about what Kant was doing and then jump into the Hegel. But of course, if you know the references, it is quite useful sometimes to have those in mind. It produces a richer reading experience. And, there's a lot of other people coming after Kant. We talk about, for example, Fichte and Schelling and then Hegel. And then we've got people like Schopenhauer, and we've got these, post-Hegelians who are sort of in his shadow. And Hegel's right there in the middle of all of this. And one of the things, so this term idealism, one of the things that is really centrally associated with it is kind of an optimism about the human capacity to understand the world, to understand ourselves, to understand our relations with others, including those in the past and those yet to come, and to frame this in terms of something that we could have in our mind. And that's part of what Hegel is doing. He thinks that the world has indeed changed in important respects with this, new philosophy that's coming on the scene that he takes himself as really developing further. So that's an important idea to keep in mind. That's not radically new. Descartes thinks he's developing a new philosophy. There's others in time as well. But with Hegel, you can say that he's part of this really important historical movement that we typically call the Enlightenment. It's also in German the Aufklärung, right? Or the siècle de lumière in French. And what we're talking about is a time period really straddling the 18th and 19th centuries, the early part of it, where there's this, idea that we can rework humanity, social structures, maybe get rid of religion, maybe purify it, maybe do all sorts of other things, bring philosophy and, the human capacity for reason front and center, get away from arbitrary arrangements, make things more free. And Hegel will himself talk about his own philosophy and the things that he's studying as a sort of developmental history of human freedom becoming more and more free over time. So those are all, important things to consider, to have in the background. If you want to read Kant beforehand, yeah, you can do that. You don't have to necessarily, as I said, read the first critique. It might actually be more helpful if you want to read critiques to read the second one, the Critique of Practical Reason. It could be very helpful to read things like Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, or the Metaphysics of Morals, or the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. There's no one single Kant text that you have to take a look at. And, Hegel's also drawing upon and responding to people like Fichte and Schelling and some of the other people who are in the background as well. So that's, one thing to keep in mind. Understanding Hegel's own project, and not just his project, but I think you could say a number of other people's projects as well. We sometimes joke about, the German idealism and completing the system of German idealism. And that's kind of an anachronistic joke because all of that business was happening 200 years ago. But Hegel is a system builder. He is working at things systematically. He wants to articulate for us and think through and invite us into this, let's call it intelligible totality that brings everything into it. He's got a rather ambitious conception of what philosophy itself can do when properly transformed. Not Kant's philosophy, not Descartes' philosophy, not Aristotle's philosophy, not Lockean philosophy, but something new, something that is up to the task of philosophical work and system building and inquiry. So that's, important, I would say, to keep in mind. Philosophy is also viewed as sort of like the central discipline, as opposed to going to a university today where, you might have to struggle to find the philosophy department and there's only a few classes that undergraduates are taking. Philosophy was viewed by Hegel and many other people of his time as being like the most central, the most important discipline that would bring together all of the others. And, there were alternate models, but Hegel would say, well, sooner or later you're doing philosophy, like it or not, so may as well do it in a really good way. That's not a conception of philosophy that everybody, even in the discipline of philosophy, shares at the present, but that is something that is driving Hegel's work. He views philosophy as unifying the other disciplines, as saying what's important in them, in judging and organizing them, and observing their development as well. So that's important to keep in mind. He's also, as you can tell, even if you've only read a few glosses on Hegel, super into this idea of historical development, the notion that human beings and their consciousness, and even human reason, or this thing that we call spirit, Geist, has been developing over time in a cumulative process that doesn't always include success stories. Sometimes there are impasses, there are dead ends that, you have to come back out of and go around. And Hegel thinks that he can observe and chart out and perhaps even contribute to in a certain way this very development that we're talking about, and he makes that something absolutely central to his philosophy. History is, you could say, highlighted as absolutely important for philosophy in a way that arguably it wasn't prior to Hegel. I mean, this is Heidegger's claim. I mean, we can talk about other people in philosophy talking about historical developments. Think about Hume and Hobbes and their views on how religion develops, or think about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but they're not doing it quite in the way that Hegel is doing it, nor with the incredible emphasis that Hegel is placing on historical development. So I think that's another thing that might be helpful to keep in mind. I think that one other thing, because I don't want to overload you with this, that might be helpful as well to realize heading in. So we often think of philosophy as something that we do as individuals, and we get to pick and choose and judge and all that sort of stuff, and that's true. But the individual, as individual, is not really that important, except for world historical individuals who come along every once in a while, and that's because they're not just themselves; they're embodying an idea or living out or developing something that has world historical implications. But what is really, really important for Hegel are, you could say, let's say 5 main domains. I mean, there is also, perception and the sciences and stuff like that, but let's put that aside for a minute. Where does Hegel think that spirit develops itself most fully? Well, there's what we can call moral life, which for Hegel is Sittlichkeit. We often translate that as ethical life, and we talk about projects, and you can see this in the Phenomenology, but in other works as well. But there's also morality, Moralität, which is a little bit different, opposed to it, something that comes out of the Enlightenment. So we've got this ethical domain, and then we've got the social political domain, which is also incredibly important and encompasses law, you could say, as well. And these, connect up together. And then we have the whole domain of art and artistic expression, which includes not just, the plastic arts, but also like tragedy and, poetry and things along those lines. That's also very important for Hegel. It assumes, you might say, a greater importance as time goes on. Religion, massively important for Hegel. Hegel thinks that, religions develop within particular cultures. They're responding to issues that arise for us human beings in our relationship to the gods, the absolute, the eternal, trying to figure out where we fit into the cosmos and what we ought to do practically. But religion is to be ultimately, you could say, supplanted by philosophy. And philosophy, as I mentioned, is this unifying discipline. So philosophy can tell us what art really is about, or what is really going on in political life, or what's really going on in all these interesting developments in morality and ethics, or what's going on in the development of religions, including the consummate religion, Christianity for Hegel. All of this is going to be discussed and tied into his system, which, it's never complete, you could say. There was at least sort of the promise that the books that he'd bring out would complete the system of German idealism. I don't think he actually did that, but he certainly goes a long way. And so keeping these things in mind about Hegel's context and about his own motivations, as he tells us about them, may be helpful for you as you carry out your studies. There is some useful advice that I can give you as somebody who's been studying Hegel, for more than half my life and teaching about Hegel, that is derived from let's call it the format of Hegel's works and his writing and his modes of thinking. So the first thing I want to say is a caution, what you should avoid doing, because I've seen it trip up so many people. And that is to approach Hegel's philosophy as if you can begin with a bunch of definitions and then proceed deductively and understand things, or at least catch Hegel in a lie or something like that. It's not that kind of philosophy. If you do that approach, you are deliberately setting yourself up to not understand what Hegel's doing. So, key Hegelian terms, you do want to try to, find out what people think that they mean and see, where they come up. For example, the distinction between being in itself, an sich sein, sometimes also translated as implicit being, and being for itself, für sich sein, along with, being for others, being in and for itself, and all that sort of stuff. You can find out what people think about those, but the real meaning of these is not always exactly the same in every instance that Hegel's using them. So you don't want to mistakenly assume that this always means this. Some philosophers, they're aiming at that sort of univocity, you could say, of language and concepts. Hegel is definitely doing something different than that. I would also say, right off the bat, another negative thing, avoid relying upon quotes or quips or sound bites. There's all sorts of things out there that people have quoted from Hegel, including the silly, on his deathbed, Hegel's saying that only one man has understood me, and even he didn't understand me. Put that sort of nonsense out of your head. Some of these things may sound cool, but they're not going to help you understand Hegel's writings and his thought, including these quips like "spirit is a bone." Well, it is a bone in a couple paragraphs of the Phenomenology, but then that's to say it's not, and there's much more going on. So don't screw yourself over by finding some passages and thinking, ooh, this explains everything. You got to go to the texts, right? Another thing that I think you should probably do, suspend. I'm not saying reject altogether, but at least suspend or bracket or put aside, nullify preconceptions that you're approaching Hegel's text with. For example, I've mentioned the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. It's not as if it's completely wrong, but it's not going to be productive for you to bring that in from some secondary text or from a website and say, aha, I know exactly what Hegel's doing, because what you're doing then is you're taking this incredibly complex thought and you're, as we say, shoehorning it into these boxes that are convenient for you, but are going to result in you not understanding what you're reading. And, there's a lot of other preconceptions that somebody might bring to Hegel's text. I would suggest, putting those aside. And what does this have to do with the format of Hegel's works? Hegel himself thinks that philosophy needs to, as much as it can be, presuppositionlessness. It's got to go at the material and look at it, straight on, and then make sense of it without imposing a whole bunch of structure on it to begin with. Another thing that I think would be helpful for you, Hegel is developing a complex context with each of the dialectical developments that he is setting out for you. So, just to take one example, probably the most famous section of the Phenomenology is the master-slave dialectic, and you could put that into a couple bullet points, but you'd be wrong to do so because it's a dialectical development, right? So you need to keep all of this in your head at the same time. This is what conceptual or notional, begriffliche thinking is actually doing, as opposed to merely, picture thinking or representational thinking, what Hegel calls Vorstellung, the philosophy of the understanding, as he denigrates it, for example, in the lectures on the philosophy of religion. you want to approach these things as if they are going to be complicated and are going to be demanding on you. We'll talk about to what degree you can easily do that in just a bit, but I think that you do want to approach his texts understanding that dialectical processes spread out over a number of paragraphs are not going to be neatly summed up in a few lines or, takeaways or something like that. You want to attend to what's actually going on. And I would say, you really do want to stick with the dialectic. You want to follow along. It's okay to raise problems and say, oh, I don't think that he's going the right way with this, or why did he go this way instead of this way? Why did he switch to this topic instead of this? That's all fair game. But if you do want to understand Hegel, you do have to kind of go along with him, at least, where you are in the works. And the last thing I'll say about this is, Hegel thinks that philosophy involves, you could call it cumulative processes, where we're putting things together into larger and larger wholes, complicated structures that we can wrap our heads around and realize that we ourselves have a place in this very wrapping our heads around, right? That's part of what it means to be conceptual, right? Or to engage in sublation or Aufhebung, another key term for Hegel as well. So if you do that and you let yourself, you could say, read into the texts and take them as if they're an interesting story or an interesting discussion by somebody who may be wrong on some points, but actually has a lot to contribute, you will probably get a lot more out of the reading as you're going along with it. And Hegel's texts are really set up in that sort of way. The last thing that I'll say, I mentioned this term Aufhebung, right? Which we often translate as sublation. There's other ways of rendering it. And I said this is very important, and it is very important. So when you go from one section to another in Hegel's texts, you should realize that the earlier sections, what's important in them, ideally, is being brought along and incorporated in what's essential to it into the next structures. And you will see in some of Hegel's texts, where he's referring back, he's like, hey, what's going on here is similar to what was happening back in this part, but it's also different. So, pay attention to those connections, and, don't move from one section to the next as if you can get through it and, think it through, and then now you leave it behind altogether. And I said that was the last thing, but I will say one other thing as well. You can't speed run through Hegel. You can't read the stuff as quickly as possible. This is not the sort of writing or text. Most philosophy doesn't reward that anyway. It's foolish to do that. But there's a lot of people out there who seem to think that you can run your eyes over the text as quickly as possible and take it into your brain. That's the opposite of the approach that Hegel would advise for you. And I think if he were here in the present, he'd be approaching people who are doing that, smacking them in the back of the head and saying, knock it off, dummy. Don't do that. Let's do a different sort of approach. So these are things that are maybe helpful for you to keep in mind, derived from the format, the style of Hegel's own texts. With Hegel, more than perhaps most other thinkers that I've come across, there's a lot of, you could say, problems and issues that the beginner, the person first approaching Hegel, might be tempted to get worried about or even obsessed over, that I think are, they're not totally off base and to be put aside forever, but they're not going to be helpful for you at the beginning. And I think that they wind up leading a lot of people to spin their wheels, so to speak, rather than get traction and move ahead. So, the first one that I would say is, if you're approaching Hegel because you're in some sort of, community of friends or fellow readers, and they're all about being on, let's call it Team Hegel. Hegel's always right, and, we just have to figure out what this brilliant man has said. I would put that aside. I wouldn't worry about, trying to make sure that everything comes out perfect as you're studying Hegel, because Hegel, he makes some mistakes like everybody does. There's things that he didn't talk about. There's matters that he did talk about, and it looks like he got them wrong. And that's okay. You don't have to feel an obligation to somehow, in your mind, defend Hegel to yourself. You can just read the stuff, and you're going to be so much better off if you do that. Now, there's a flip side. There are so many critics of Hegel out there, and some of them actually have some decent things to say. Some of them have decent things to say, but draw the wrong conclusions from those criticisms that they have. Some of the criticisms show that the person really didn't understand Hegel, or might be reacting less against Hegel and more against Hegelians. A lot of Kierkegaard's criticisms, I would say, Søren Kierkegaard's, are more directed at the Hegelians of his time than at Hegel himself. And then, there's some that are unfair. And here's the thing. You don't actually have to defend Hegel against all these other people either. If Karl Popper wants to think that, Hegel was, leading us towards totalitarianism and against open societies and led to fascism, hey, Karl Popper can be wrong and mean-spirited and foolish in that respect as much as he wants. It doesn't have to do anything with you, right? And the guy's long dead. You don't have to worry about that. If Bertrand Russell or, I mentioned A.G. Grayling want to get Hegel wrong, that's not affecting you. You don't have to worry about that as you're reading Hegel's text. Every single philosopher is criticized by not just somebody, but a whole bunch of somebodies. Pick any one that you want. If they've got, any sort of, let's call it notoriety or fame, somebody's going after them. So you don't have to worry about that yourself. I will also say, once again, shifting back to this topic of criticism, Hegel himself is engaging in criticism of a number of different movements and ideas and approaches to things. Sometimes he's on base, sometimes he's off, or he's only getting partly things right. So again, you don't have to worry so much about that as you're studying it. So for example, in the Phenomenology, Hegel's discussion of Stoicism there is clearly not engaged with historical Stoicism. It's engaged with something of a caricature, which was becoming kind of common in his time. There's a story that we could tell about that, but it's clearly an inadequate picture of the philosophical system, movement, whatever you want to call it, of Stoicism. His discussions of it in the History of Philosophy, a little bit better, still not entirely there. What you want to do is figure out, well, what's right in his criticism? What is he actually targeting? What does he have in mind? What can I get from this? His discussion in the Phenomenology of the phrenology and physiognomy of his time, holy crap, is that good? That has massive implications, not just for those two disciplines at that time, but even for the overinflated claims made by some people today on the basis of, what's going on with brain states, or pick whatever else you want that has to do with the relationship between consciousness and the body. So, some of his critiques are really on point, some of them aren't. Don't worry at this point about whether the critiques are entirely correct or something like that. Just see what he's actually saying. And then you can work at it later on after you've looked at those matters that he's looking at rather negatively. Another thing I've already mentioned, Hegel did not get everything right. You don't need to be preoccupied as you're reading it through with determining, here's the stuff he got right, here's the stuff he got wrong, and drawing a nice list that's got, everything set up on different sides. That's part of the process of you studying it. First, you got to actually understand what the guy is saying, and that's difficult, right? So figure out what he's saying before worrying about whether he's 100% correct about stuff. And if he's not 100% correct, that doesn't mean that the philosophy is valueless, or even that studying the stuff that he seems to get wrong is without value. You can get a lot out of figuring out, well, where does he actually go wrong? But first you have to understand the stuff. Another thing that I've seen people sometimes get caught, snagged, let's say, in the process of studying Hegel is they'll try to understand a paragraph in a difficult section, like force in the understanding, and they can't figure out what Hegel's saying. And they're like, I'm stuck on this paragraph. I can't move on to the other stuff. No, move on to the other stuff. You'll come back to that paragraph, and maybe it will make more sense the next time around. You don't have to, understand every single thing as you're going along, or else it's totally, without value. You've lost the path of the dialectic. No, that's not the way it works. It's not the way it works with most other philosophers. If you're reading Descartes and you don't understand something, and you've made some good efforts to try to figure out what the hell he's saying, or Kant, or whoever else, it's okay to move on to the next thing. It's not going to damage your brain. As a matter of fact, you're more likely to screw yourself up by obsessing at this one point. I have to figure out what this is, right? You just move on, and you can figure it out later on. You can come back to it later on. And the other thing that I'll say, too, is, where Hegel is wrong, and sometimes we could say deplorably so, the criticisms that we can make of him for, racism or ethnocentrism. For example, when he says in the Philosophy of History that Africa has no history, and you're like, well, that doesn't sound right. Clearly it does. These are the sort of things where you set it aside. You don't need to be worried about that right now. Somebody can be, racist and also be, a philosopher who's got some things to contribute in other matters, right? So you don't believe Hegel when it comes to Africa and history, or, the hierarchy of different types of people. You can say, that's a product of the backwards racist ideas of the time, and, some prejudices, some, prejudging things. Same thing with his, you could accuse him of gender essentialism or misogyny or being patriarchal. Yeah, he is. I mean, that is how he thought of things in terms of men and women and the family, and that whole stuff. That doesn't have to mean that you can't get anything out of studying his work. Maybe you come back to it later on and you can produce criticisms and say, here's what we need to keep and here's what we need to get rid of. That's fine. But the first time you're going through a Hegelian text, it's probably not going to be helpful for you to approach it with all of that as your main thing that you're trying to do. The key thing is to develop understanding. And I'll say to you what I say to my students in nearly every class where we're reading original texts every semester. There's appreciation, right? And if you appreciate Hegel, that's great. There's agreement, there's endorsement, and then there's understanding. And you really can't do these other things in any competent way without understanding. Understanding comes first. You don't have to agree with somebody to understand them. You don't have to appreciate them to understand them. You don't have to endorse them to understand them. But you do need to understand them if you want to competently, in a well-grounded way, do any of these other things. So all of this hopefully gives you some pointers for how you can do precisely that. It's not going to be easy. Hegel is one of the more difficult thinkers that you can encounter, but hopefully some of this advice will be helpful for you as you engage in self-directed study. I do have a few resources, derived from the Half-Hour Hegel Project. If you're going into the phenomenology, that could be helpful for you. A lot of commentary videos. I'm getting close to having finished the entire series. But there's a lot of other great stuff out there that you can access as well, including lectures on the science of logic. And you just have to look around and you'll find these people and sites and channels where these resources are available for you. I think that it is definitely worth studying Hegel. I hope that you will, at least some of you viewers, will take on the task, or if you're already doing it, continue the task of trying to make sense out of this very important 19th century German idealist thinker.